So, John, I am going to start with an introduction, and
Okay.
I did say a little bit of it before. Mark is a friend of mine that we go back in recovery. Mark's 2 years more sober than me, John, and we met in 1986 in Liverpool, in Western Sydney, in a 12-step meeting, and we've become friends ever since. I think we co-sponsored each other for 20 years. But the reason I mention this is, back in the days of when there was no men's gatherings, no men's retreats, no men's literature, we started to get a couple of books. The Flying Boy was one. There was Iron John by Robert Bly, and there was Sam Keen's Fire in the Belly, and Robert Moore's books were coming through. There was, and we were hungry, and we started running men's retreats. And I think, Mark, we would have been one where we did a whole retreat just on your cassette. We just on the cassette only of the father-son wound. And we just all met, and we'd cook good food. We'd sit around a fire and we'd play that cassette and we'd just share. And so it was like, down under, even though I know over there. And for you guys, I'll put some resources together. But if you want to listen to something quite magical, John and his band of merry men, those guys I mentioned and many more, started the Minnesota Men's Conference. And I was talking to Alexandra Katahakis this week about you, John, that I said, I don't think those guys knew when they just put a mic out in that room 30 years ago that people all over the world would be listening on YouTube to their talks, because it was such an intimate moment of men sharing from the heart, living on the frontier of new mental health and spirituality, right? So this week I've had the privilege to listen to your talks on passivity. I've listened in the last month to your talks on, and I'm just going to enter someone into the room, mate, that's coming. So, and so the talks on passivity that you gave at those conferences, and this morning while I was raking the yard, I listened to a talk on the Flying Boy. And I suppose I wanted to convey to the community before you spoke here, just the people that are going to listen to this talk, that in that talk, you were talking about your own story, but like every man's story, it became the story of many. You talked about the hole inside that came from the trauma of your upbringing, especially the fatherlessness that you received, and that hole that then went out into living from the neck up, and in sex addiction treatment, I've talked about men living from the neck up and the groin down, and that hole in the middle, right, that we just haven't been able to regulate, tolerate, or even accommodate living in our own bodies. And that was your conversation many years ago, and your own painful journey shared. And I think I said to guys before we've logged in officially this morning, that John was talking about codependency at the beginning. He was talking about prodependency before Robert Weiss. He was talking about the body keeps the score before Bessel van der Kolk, and going to that level of healing necessary. And I suppose what I wanted to say, I know Mark and I are still in long-term recovery. We still call each other once a week, and we talk from the heart, and have done now for 35 years. And John, that is just one slice of the benefit of you taking a risk and sharing many years ago, just your story, taking the courage to be a man from Alabama, living in Texas, speaking about his feelings. I don't think anyone will ever really be able to work out just how dangerous that must have been. And I've spent a lot of time in Texas, and man, that's not a place that you walk around talking about your feelings, right? So John, that's a long introduction, but I just really wanted to also say this. On your passivity talk, you said to Robert Bly that you made the mistake once when you had a co-facilitator that you loved and admired, but when she left the room was when you said that you loved her. And you turned to Robert Bly, I imagine, in this talk, and you said, Robert, I don't want that to happen here. I love you. Yeah, and I, John, I just want to say you've counseled me, you've supervised me, and you've mentored me. And just that from men everywhere, I want to say that I love you. I love the work that you do. I love the way that you live. And I love that at 5 o'clock on a Friday night, when you should be knocking off and patting your dogs, you're going to talk to a bunch of Australians about recovery. And there you go. There you go. And so that's my introduction to you. So thank you. And with love, John, the space is yours to talk and manage any way you want, and I'll help you any way I can.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Good Lord, I'm going to sign off now. It's going to fill that big ass screen. It's just getting so big from listening to all that. And no wonder I'm tired. I've been doing this for a long time, but I sure thank you for doing this again. How many times have we done this?
I got a feeling it's 3 or 4 now. Yeah,
I think,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you very much, Steve, for that kindness and that support and that love. And I love you too. And God, I wouldn't take anything in the world for our friendship. So I'm going to tell you a little story about how this book came into being real quick. I don't know if you can see it, but
we can, John. Yes.
Yeah, it's called The Flying Boy Letters, Getting Back to Y'all 30 Years Later. The little story that goes with this book is back in the 80s, back then, people would actually write letters. They would type them or write them out by hand. And so the Flying Boy, I'm happy to say, was selling so much, a large degree thanks to Oprah and Robert Bly and John Bradshaw and Pia Melody and others. And so the letters kept coming in with these questions and thoughts. And so I kept throwing them in a box thinking, oh, this Flying Boy stuff is going to come to an end real soon. And I'm going to go back to teaching college. And so the letters kept coming in and I'd throw them in a box and I go, now I'm going to answer these once all this hoopla is over around the book. And I figured, well, that's the only book I'm going to write. And so I just kept tossing them in a box. And then a couple of years ago, my assistant was cleaning out my office and she found all these letters that I had totally forgotten because after The Flying Boy came out, well, so did 25 other books, you know, and so I just never got around to answering them. And she pulled them out and read a bunch. And she said, so what do you want to do with these? And I said, well, we could make a book out of these letters. And she said, no, that's not right. Let's make a book, you answering these letters 30 years later, which means, sadly, that some of the people who wrote me 30, 34 years ago, you know, were like 80 or 90 or dead, you know. So I'm kind of sending back letters to people who wrote me at 25, but now they're 55. You know. So that's just a little thing about that book. I think y'all got some there to go away. I think I'm going to start out to see if I can calm myself down a little bit. I'm going to start out with a poem by Rilke. Maybe some of you know it. It's a German poet from late 1800s, early 1900s. And it goes like this. Sometimes a man stands up during supper and walks outdoors because of a church that stands somewhere in the east. And his children say blessings on him as if he were dead, while other men stay inside the house with dishes and glasses, and he forces his children to go far out into the world to find that same church which he forgot. That's kind of to set the tone here. I wanted this to be unlike the others, and Steve was happy to oblige that we've been doing only men only, but this time we thought we would invite women to participate and ask questions and and listen to me ramble on, but I'm going to say it again a little bit slower this time. Sometimes a man stands up during supper and walks outdoors because of a church that stands somewhere in the east. And this poem is one of my favorites because the people on this screen, the people in this room in Australia, and myself and many others, we didn't have fathers who stood up during supper and walked outdoors to find that church that stands in the east. So his children, though, say blessings on the men who will get up at 8 o'clock in the morning, women who will get up at 8 o'clock in the morning to attend something like this. And mostly it is a result of our parents not doing it. And that's no guilt on them, that's no shame on them, but it's like something was calling us to get up and go out on this journey. And we're all still on it. But other men, like my dad, maybe your dad, stayed inside the house with the dishes and the glasses. And the first time I read that poem back when I was 25 years old, and I'm 70 now, the first image I had when it said glasses was the little shot glasses that you pour whiskey into and take, you know. And my dad was an alcoholic and whiskey was around all the time, as were these little shot glasses. And so because he didn't do that, we had to go out. So that's the little poem by Rilke. Okay? Now, Steve, do you want to ask some questions to get us rolling? Do you want to turn it over to the kind people in the room and on the screen? I can go any way you want to go.
Yeah, that's, you know, John, it's one of those things that I would be really happy if you spoke with whatever is of interest at you at the moment. You know, if it's a retrospective of some of those issues. I mean, yesterday we had in Australia, well, it was International Men's Day and also White Ribbon Day. So you've written some really seminal books on anger and management, and when I was listening to The Flying Boy this morning, I think I was certainly hearing about where the origins of that unlived life and that sort of repressed anger and I know that addictions and all of that are just what we use to medicate that unhappiness, that deep hole that never got filled. So I suppose I'd be interested in that. But of course, if anyone's come with a question or something you want to know about, yeah, this is, I think anyone.
Yeah, just
put it in the chat or unmute and as we go through, John, if anyone wants to ask, please.
Yeah, please do.
Conversation.
That's my favorite part of something like this is when questions come, sometimes answers come out that I never thought about it. I've heard questions for 35 years, but I always hear these new questions. So let me just start out with The Flying Boy. So I wrote that nearly 35 years ago. I was 33 years old. I'd been studying men's stuff since 1976. People like Warren Farrell and others had begun talking about men in a way that heretofore we had not been discussing men. And then Robert Bly comes, and Robert, most of you know, is a poet par excellence, who storyteller, brilliant speaker, and essentially the father of the men's movement. So I started reading some about him in 1980. Now, in 1980, I was a head on a stick. So what he was saying was appealing to me intellectually, like Steve was saying, but it wasn't resonating from here down, because from here down, I had so shut down early as a kid for numerous reasons, a lot of trauma-based reasons. But I started thinking about what he was saying, and I thought, you know, only really educated intellectual men, for the most part, is going to be able to follow him, because he was a student of Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, and he knew mythology in backwards and forwards and fairy tales. And I thought, I'm going to try to write this book about my own journey as a man who could not make a commitment to the women he loved, to his vocation. I couldn't make a commitment to exploring my emotions or feelings. You know, somebody would ask me back then, so John, how does that make you feel? And I would always tell them how it made me think. I just didn't know that there was answers from the body that just couldn't come out of me because of being shut down. In the States, and having been to Australia numerous times, there's this thing about boys that by the age 6, and certainly by the ages of 13, they have disassociated from their bodies, disconnected from their bodies, gone numb and shut down. And we didn't even know it. We didn't even know it. We just thought, this is what boys do, you know. And then I remember in my late 20s, early 30s, a woman might say to me, so why don't you open up and tell me what you feel? And I go, I don't know what you're saying. What do you mean, open up and tell you what I feel? And they'd go, yeah, see, that's the problem with you, John. You live in your head, you think, you read these books. And so, you know, I'm studying this stuff, writing this stuff. But the father-son wound, which was really a big, important part of the whole early men's movement, the father-son wound had not been in depth talked about from the heart, from the belly, from the balls. It just hadn't come up. So Robert starts talking about men and their sons and the relationship. And I started looking at my own, and I went, oh my God, this is terrible. I lived with an absent father, an emotionally shut down father, an alcoholic, an abusive, physically abusive man. What does that translate to me? How am I being a man in the world? And what I realized, and this is why I called the book Flying Boy, what I realized was that I was a boy in a man's body. Yes, I was a professor teaching college at University of Alabama and University of Texas, but there's a way in which I still thought of myself as an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old, even at 30. And so I knew that was something that was faulty and needed to be corrected, but I didn't really know how. And then Robert steps up to the plate, and I go, oh my God, this man is talking to me. Now, in the process, this woman that I love very, very much, as far as a man who didn't have a body could love, but this woman I love very, very much, she finally had enough of being with a shut down, closed off, numb, semi-intellectual, and she got fed up and she decided to leave. And so all this time I'm working on these ideas about Robert Bly, this beginning of the men's movement, this thing about me not being able to commit to an occupation, a city, a person. And she left. And when she left on the final day, I said to her, "You've got to tell me why you're leaving so I can at least intellectually understand." And she said the following words: "You're the angriest man I've ever known." And I just heard that, and this was before computers, but it did not compute. I said, in all earnestness, I said, "I've never pushed you, shoved you, hit you, or slapped you. How can you call me the angriest man you've ever known? I teach religious studies, for God's sake. I teach poetry, for God's sakes. And I just don't get it, because the way I grew up in the South, hitting, slapping, pushing, and shoving was what was labeled as abuse. But I wasn't doing any of those. But I was shaming, demeaning, demoralizing, criticizing, preaching, teaching, judging, and analyzing, which were all forms of dysfunctional anger and what I later labeled as rage. And then I said, "Is there what else? What's the other reasons you're leaving?" And she said, "Oh my God, John, you're the saddest man I've ever known." And I went, "Oh my God, can that really be so?" I knew I was one of the most depressed men, that I'd run into, but sad. And so that began, Robert Bly began talking about grief. I began talking about anger, wrote the Flying Boy book. Robert read it, talked about it at men's workshops when he and Michael Mead and James Hillman were working together. And then around 1991, he and I started doing conferences together. So the Flying Boy came out, and nobody would publish it. And we self-published it back in the day when nobody much did that. And then it got picked up, and then I got on Oprah 3 or 4 times. And here I sit talking about a life that is like a million years ago. But had it not been for the Flying Boy and all the giants that I stood on their shoulders, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to anybody,
John, could one thing that struck me this morning that stuck out as ahead of its time, and you're talking about it now with grief and anger, and a modern exponent of trauma work, Pete Walker, who I follow at the moment, it talks deeply into this being a rescue for people that have been traumatized, that they've got to do grieving and angering, which is what you're talking about. Could you talk a little bit more about when you were talking about the Flying Boy when it came out? You talked about when a boy didn't get that love and care, it wasn't okay to have their feelings, but then they were also struck that more men than women were hit, although a lot of women were abused too. But boys were hit for longer generally. And you talked about the freezing that happens, how it, and then years later, here you are, your partner is saying, well, you're the saddest person, not able to grieve. You're the angriest person, not able to anger. And I just wanted you to talk about maybe that connection between being frozen through trauma and abuse and criticism as a child, and how you think that plays out as an adult, and how you've learned to help people and yourself get through that. How did you do the angering and grieving to start to shift that once you were able to start to see it?
Well, again, one of the greatest catalysts for change is crisis, loss, death, breakups, divorces, children dying. And so her leaving just damn near killed me because I couldn't really understand why. So I went into Jungian analysis, I went into Freudian analysis, and they were all really great talking therapists. But I realized that there was something that was stuck and frozen, and that was my feelings and my emotions. So I sought out every kind of body therapy that was offered in Austin, because Austin back then especially had every kind of therapy and new age thing and body work was available. And so I found a therapist, Dan Jones, that I talk about in my book, and he and I worked together, and he was totally not interested in the narrative of my life. He wanted to know, was I angry at my dad for the beatings I received? Was I angry to see my mom beaten, my sister, And I just couldn't get to it for the longest time. But he kept steadily working with me. And I started doing body therapy, Rolfing, shiatsu. I did dance therapy, movement therapy, worked with a shaman, everything I could do to just what I call get my body back and thaw the hell out and be somebody who could sort of follow feelings, be able to learn how to articulate those feelings. And so everything that I've done in my books kind of comes down to opening up the body, descending into the grief, letting the anger come out appropriately so that we can be more connected to the people we love, especially, and to our friends and children. So Robert sort of was the king of grief work, and I was, his friend and student and colleague. But then I wanted to bring this whole anger stuff out because in the men's movement early on in the 80s, there was no discussion of anger and rage. And so once I started getting my body back, getting my tears back, getting what I realized, and this is something I've written 3 books on anger so far, is I had to come to this understanding that I've been teaching clinicians and the general public for 30-something years, that what Laurel said in the Flying Boy book, that you're the angriest man I've ever known, what I came to distinguish was the difference between anger and rage. And what she really meant, and she had the language that I tried to develop afterwards, what she really meant was, John, you're full of rage. See, not anger, but rage. Anger is a feeling and an emotion that, if it's expressed appropriately, equals energy, intimacy, and serenity. What I found out was that rage is an action or a behavior that numbs people's feelings. And I read everything I could on anger, and these authors and psychologists kept using the words anger and rage interchangeably as if they meant the same thing. And what I wrote in my first book, Facing the Fire, Experiencing and Expressing Anger Appropriately, is they were very different things. Anger expressed appropriately equals energy, intimacy, and serenity, and rage always equals distance, disaster, and divorce. And so what Laurel was experiencing was my not only frozenness around emotion, but this kind of rage that was sort of cerebral, intellectual, but just as damaging as it could possibly be. And once you start opening up your grief well, and you start letting the anger out, then all the emotions becomes more available, including joy and happiness. So that's the long version of that answer.
No, thank you, John. Thank you. John, I know it's this day and age, people seem to try and process anger more peacefully. But back when, like I remember attending a workshop of yours, and one of your techniques was you used to put out two fingers. I think you might remember this, and you'd get people to just grab these fingers and squeeze them as hard as you can for as angry as you feel. And one of the things I remember that you used to do is you mightn't be angry right now, but if you could imagine the day that you would be really angry, where it might all come out, squeeze them as hard as maybe you think you'd be that angry on that day. And for a lot of folks, including myself, that anger would come up and out. And I know that some of the fears that I used to hear is, well, I'm afraid it'll get out of control, or I'm afraid it's just that fear of the unknown. If I let myself get that angry, won't someone get hurt? Won't I get hurt? Or even minimizing it. Isn't it just silly and stupid? There was a technique of yours that used to talk about twisting a towel and putting just trying to move some of that energy in the body.
Yeah.
And I think it's a missed message today that people in that somatic work, body work. I remember after hearing you guys talk about that sort of therapy, I went and got polarity therapy, which was a body-based. The guy used to push into my stomach, get me to scream into a towel. It was the oddest thing, but I was full of that rage that you spoke about due to an aggressive mother and violent abuse as a child. So it made sense. So I suppose maybe if you want to talk a little bit about those, the physicality of doing some of this work, that this is a contact sort of sport, this sort of therapy, right? Yeah.
Well, see, what I learned from Dan and all the different therapists that were using the body to express was what I developed, and we called back then body-centered psychotherapy. And later on, there becomes a whole institution for body-centered psychotherapy. And that then merges into somatic therapy, like with Peter Levine and others. But it was like, talking was good, talking was important, but I needed to physicalize the pent-up emotions and not just use my tongue to express it, but like twisting the towel. I'd say I would twist the towel myself, as angry as I knew I had the right to be, even if I couldn't feel it. But once you start twisting, or once my clients or workshop people started twisting, then the emotions just come out. So I started this training program and ran it for 28 years, teaching clinicians and the general public how to work with emotional release techniques. And that was called PEER, Primary Emotional Energy Recovery. And, trained several thousand people in different cities and different countries. But that's where I began, was seeing that, there's got to be movement, there's got to be physicality, there's got to be a way to release other than just speak about it. And I got to tell you, when I first had the opportunities to physicalize it with Dan and others, man, I was scared to death. And, I remember Dan handed me a big overstuffed pillow and just saying, hit this pillow as hard as your dad hit you. And I just handed him back the pillow and I'd say, you're fucking crazy. I ain't hitting this damn pillow. What would that do? Why? But the bottom line answer was I said the very same words that I've heard now thousands of times, that if I ever go there, I'm afraid I'll never come back, and that I'll end up some way being an abusive man, like my dad, my uncles, my grandfathers, all the people that I grew up with and did not want to be alike. And so I went 9 sessions before he handed me the pillow on something else that we were talking about. And I took the pillow and I just tapped it just a little bit. And I handed it back to him. I said, now, are you satisfied? Can we just talk about how I'm going to get Laurel back? Because that's really all I want to know. And in the 10th session, something broke inside me. And man, I started pounding pillows, screaming, yelling, sobbing. And it was like, oh my God. So this is what it's like to not be sterile, shut down, numbed out. And in that room with him and thousands of rooms since, nobody got hurt. Nobody got hurt. Nobody climbed up on a tower with a machine gun and shot people. It was just a process of letting this stuff come out. And Robert Bly in Iron John talked about this pond, this lake, and the man goes to it and he dips out this lake and he finds this rusty iron man down in there. And I knew immediately from reading that story back in the 80s that what he was talking about is a man or woman, either one, has to dip out this lake of grief one bucket at a time. And I thought, oh man, I got a lot of bucket work to do.
I know, John, when you wrote about in the talk on passivity and sort of passivity being a response to being abused, and then the frozenness and living from the head up, and you know, whether you become a sort of a redneck and more rural or an intellectual, and we're all hiding somewhere in that passivity. And I was just trying to sort of take notes the other day when you were, you in the second part of that sort of talk, you talked about, well, there's the anger work and then the grief work, which you're talking about, and then making that point about, one of the things you said is that every loss or transition needs to be grieved, which you're linking there to Bly's work around the bucketing, that we've sort of got to spend that, once we get past that passivity and frozenness and get some of the anger out of the way, then we're into the grief, and to not rush the grief work, right? It's that it's going to take the time that it takes to do that work and to grieve, and that, as you said, that unblocking the grief and the sadness will also unlock happiness and joy too. It's all going to come pouring out at the same time. I know you talked about you also said that ritualizing that is useful, resulting in a ceremony at the end. And the other thing you said is that, just the importance of doing it in community. I know a lot of us that are listening today and that probably will listen to this are either in a 12-step fellowship, a church, a deeper sort of church group, because a lot of church groups are gospel driven, but some of the groups are either for addictions or betrayal support, or so we've all joined largely in this room some form of community or men's group. Could you talk a little bit about just the power that comes from when you start to do that bucketing around others?
Right. Well, there's a old African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, take someone with you. See? And I was the lone wolf. I wasn't going to depend on anybody. I wasn't going to ask anybody for help. So I was moving pretty fast in some ways. But like you said, I realized that if I can do some of this work by myself, that's great. But if I have 10 men or 20 men and women in this room with me, I'm going to do that more deeply over time. And so people would say to me, John, I know I need to do grief work, but I don't know exactly how to get started. So I came up with this it's kind of linear in a way, and it's not really meant to be. But when people kept asking me that enough, I finally said, well, here's 4 or 5 steps, and I'm going to give those to you now in order to deepen your grief work. And I'd say the first thing is you need to know, and you said this, Steve, just a moment ago, you need to know that you need to mourn and grieve every loss, every change, and every transition. That you just got to accept that when your kid goes to kindergarten, that's a change, a transition, a loss. Now, you don't have to break down in your living room and sob your eyes out, but you might want to, because that kid's never coming back from kindergarten. And, you know, when the kid goes to college, that kid is never coming back. So all these stages of life and these changes, the divorces, the loss of jobs, the physical losses, monetary losses, parental loss, every change, transition, and loss must be grieved. The second part of this scheme is that you got to be able to ritualize your grief. And that could look like, well, so many different things, but most people don't ritualize their grief. They do what I call hit or miss grieving. They'll go to a workshop and do some grief work that weekend, maybe, or they'll go to their therapist and tap into their grief, or they'll go to a 12-step meeting and tap into their grief, but then they don't keep going with it. So what I did when I was writing The Flying Boy and doing all this deep grief work, I wanted to make sure that I ritualized it. So like when my ex-wife of 16 years, when we divorced, I wrote every morning in my journal for 90 days the sadness that I felt in this change and transition and loss. I didn't do, and I tell people, well, maybe for you, you could go out to the woods and talk to the earth about the change or loss one time a week or one time a month. In the South, we have Decoration Day, which is an old Southern thing where in May, you go to the graveyard and you decorate the graveyard. And so I didn't do that, but I got to this place where I really felt the grief and loss of losing my grandfather. And so once a year, I would go and I'd write this little note to him and I would stick it down into the plot or whatever you call it. And sometimes I'd cry and sometimes I wouldn't. But I did that for several years because I needed to do a ritual around that once a year. And so the third thing needs to be time, that you give yourself and others the time to move through their losses, change, and transitions in whatever time sequence that they need to do it. I'll tell you a sidebar story. I was training therapists in New York for a weekend, And I was teaching the whole weekend on grief. And so I said, don't let anybody tell you when they think you are stuck in your grief and you need to move on. I said, never let anybody, therapists, parents, nobody, tell you, oh, you've been grieving way too long about this loss. Anyway, I was doing that. And this psychologist raised his hand. And I said, yeah, what do you want to say? And he said, well, I'm a trained psychologist, PhD, and I can actually tell when somebody needs to move on. And I said, no, you can't. You can't do that. He said, no, really, I can see it. I said, maybe you can, but no, let's not go there. And so I started again. And then about 15 minutes later, he raises his hand again. He said, John, I'm sorry to disagree with you this way, but I just got to tell you and the rest of the audience that you can tell when somebody is stuck in their grief. And I said, well, I hear you. Now, please don't interrupt me anymore. And so about 15 minutes later, he raises his hand. I said, wait a minute. Let's do this little exercise. I said, if you can tell me that you would know when somebody who lost their entire family in Auschwitz or Buchenwald, if you can tell me that you know when they're stuck in their grief. And he said, and I said, and if you can, I'll let you stay. And he said, I can. I said, get your stuff and leave. That's the only person I've ever kicked out of a workshop or training in 35 years. He just insisted that he knew when you on this screen should be done and move on. So take your time, take your time. Make sure you know that you got to do it. Give yourself a ritual that's comfortable for you and right for you. Take the time you need. And then what Steve was said, then build a community of like-minded, supportive people who will be with you while you go through this dark night of the soul, while you're letting go of this sadness, whatever length of time it takes. But don't be around people who tell you you need to get back in the saddle, you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, it's just water under the bridge, let sleeping dogs lie. I don't know if any of these are cliches that y'all heard in Australia. But just take your time and be with people who are going to be with you at time. And then the fifth thing is ceremony. The ceremony that you share with your community of support that you're mostly now moving out of this time of grief and sadness.
Yeah, John, on that, I know that you've talked in the past about, when we've got that childhood trauma, where we go into that frozenness, the passivity, the addictions, the violence that comes out of that, the inability to be in honest and real relationships. I know you talked about one of the other areas of coming out of passivity, and I want to talk about ceremony first, but then active loving. So we'll get to active loving because that making that choice. But we don't initiate well we initiate generally peer-to-peer, not mentor to mentee. And I suppose in ceremony, sometimes, I don't know if you can spend a little bit more time just talking about celebrating those transitions of moving from a place where you've done some grieving or done some healing or done maybe, so feel like you're crossing a threshold with your mother work or your father work. And I know the Carolyn Miss, who's a sort of a body worker in spirit, she talks about people getting stuck in their woundology. They identify themselves through their trauma and don't move on. maybe just your thoughts on that importance of giving the time, everything you said, giving the time, but then maybe some of your experience of that transitioning, of letting go of the ceremony that allows you to note that, look, I probably will revisit that occasionally, but you know what? I think I'm nearly done there. I've done a lot of work there, and I want to acknowledge that. Maybe speak a little bit more into that.
Yeah, it reminds me of some exercises I did with people. There's an addiction to the narrative where you tell essentially this same story over and over and over again to your therapist, over and over again to your friends, over and over at your 12-step group. And it just goes on, and they're just stuck in it. So a few times, more than a few times, I've asked people to write their story down, in sentences, paragraphs, pages, whatever it is, and then find a place out in nature or the beach or the mountains and take that story and bore out a hole in the ground and place that story in there and then cover it up. And so then after that, you can talk about the emotions around the story. You can talk about the feelings around the story, but you're not going to keep telling the story. And I would say now there's the place where I would say that is not totally correct is if somebody you're with, if it would help them to tell your story, then you bring it sort of out of the ground, share your story with the compassion and empathy as a means to help. And then once that's done, then you metaphorically, you put your story back in the ground. Because, I've been to a lot of 12-step meetings, as I know many of y'all had, and you'll hear that person just keep telling the story over and over again. And one of the things I've said a lot, just as a sidebar to that, people would say, well, I get tired of going to these meetings and hearing these stories over and over again. And I said, well, somebody had to hear your stories over and over again. But you got to remember that 12-step work is not therapy. It's not men's work. It's not women's groups. That 12-step work is for getting you sober, whatever addiction is running us. And then you got to add to this work some of the stuff that the 12 steps and in that room was just not particularly designed. You can't really say in AA, you can't really say, I want to talk about the abuse that my father dished out that I've never talked about. Because you've got 5 minutes, You can talk about the alcoholism as it relates to the abuse, but somewhere you've got to talk about the abuse, the trauma, the hurt, the pain, the disappointment, the abandonment, and you got to get sober enough to be able to go to those places. And so God knows the 12-step communities that I belong to, Al-Anon, Adult Children of Alcoholics, Codependents Anonymous, AA, I wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for those meetings. But I also wouldn't be sitting here if I hadn't added this body work, this emotional release work, all these people like Pia Melody and John Bradshaw. See, you can't get a lecture on John Bradshaw at an NA meeting. So you got to go out and create a community of people that want to delve into these kinds of things and explore them.
John, maybe just the last thing I'll ask you, and then we'll sort of move towards closing without any other questions. But maybe I suppose after we come out of the frozenness, we do the grieving, we do the angering, we ritualize it, we form community, we find a place to stand and belong, and then, like you said, some ceremonial goodbyes. We've opened up a new world. That this idea of active loving, right? Choosing to love, because I think one of the things I've noticed as a traumatized boy and a largely addicted man was that loving is terrifying, right? The fear of being hurt, the fear of being rejected, the tolerating that fear in your body now that you can feel again. Maybe just talk your thoughts on and your own experiences on actively loving, not just in a romantic love, but just life, right? Risking and then being in the adventure that life is.
Well, people who grew up in dysfunctional homes, we think we're supposed to know how to do stuff that nobody's shown us. There was no real active loving in my home. There was tolerating and there was abuse and there was arguments and fights. And ever so often, we didn't get hugged as kids. We didn't get caressed as kids. So first part is that we're not supposed to know how to do something until somebody models it or shows us how. And so people will say, well, I don't really know what love is, or I don't know how to love. And I go, have you had anybody that knew that and could teach that? And most of the time, men especially, but some women too, will say, no, I guess I haven't. Okay, then that's where you start. And so ideally that, like in my life, beginning at around 33, 34, I had these men and women, therapists and teachers and stuff that loved me and began filling up my cup of love, which then allowed me to begin to pour out that cup of love. But I had to be shown how to do it. I had to be modeled. Robert Bly was one of my very best teachers of really, he showed me, like I hope I've shown you some, Steve, of how to love and be loved. And the truth is that, my family sadly was just not a very loving family. And I know that may not apply to a lot of you on the screen, but they did the best they could with what was taught to them. But that's a loss. And so not receiving a lot of love, not knowing how to love, had to be deeply, deeply grieved there. And then the whole thing, as everybody knows, this whole thing about love, we have one word. I love my truck. I love my dogs. And I love my wife. It's like the same word for truck, dogs, and wife or husband. And so, I started studying love a long time ago and realized there's, the Greeks have 3 words for love, and Latin, there's another word for love. But there's philios, which is love of friends and community. Eros, which simply means not sex, though it can include sex, but passion. Passion is what eros really means. Eros, philios, agape, a spiritual love, and in Latin, the word is caritas, or the love of the AA community or the men's groups or women's groups that you're in. And sadly, we have one word for my truck, my dogs, and my wife. So we have to expand not only our emotional range, but our verbal range for expressing love. And, people would say to me years ago, John, you talk about anger, grief, passivity, loss, men's issues, father, son, mother, son. Talk to us about love. And I would just simply answer like I'm going to answer now at 70 years old. I don't know enough about love to talk about it for more than 5 minutes or less. I think I know how to experience it more than I ever have. I think I learned how to extend it more than I did. But, I can talk about anger for 4 days. I can talk about grief for 3. I can talk about father-son wounds for a day. I can talk about mother-son wounds for a day. But I'm still a student as far as love goes.
I bet. Mate, let me say a couple of things. Firstly, thank you for the generosity of your eldership to just sign up for this on a crazy invitation from a crazy Aussie to keep coming down under and talk to my small community of people that come. Every person you've spoken to, I know their hearts at some deep level, and I'm just grateful that we can spend time standing up and walking towards the church in the East. I just trust that recovery for me has been taking those risks and being able to just go to other places and hear something new that might help me grieve, anger, and love. And I suppose, John, I want to just say the other thing I want to say. Yesterday from school, my 10-year-old and 8-year-old brought home a box that they're obviously been encouraged to do at school, to bring their mum and dad for homeschooling. And I'll probably be emotional in this, but both Marshall and Maverick, my 2 eldest, wrote letters to us. And I keep all the things. I got a treasure box in my closet with all the things that they've made. They're very special to me. I've always tried to have a house where it's a non-violent house. And if I do get that anger, my rage comes up, I make a public apology to their mother in front of the boys. I think it's important to see that what's okay, and it's okay to be perfectly imperfect. But they both wrote about how much they knew that they were loved. And they both wrote that my eldest said that I was kind to him. And I remember the thing that was absent in my own childhood was kindness. I knew my mother loved me, but she was unable to express it due to her own illness.
Right.
And I just felt joy that they felt that in this house.
Yeah.
They knew that they were safe, that they knew that they were loved, and that they could see the kindness. And I'm sort of, John, I have to say that when my own father passed, I was able to hug him. I had to teach him to hug. That was I might read one of the poems around that for Movember. But I'm just grateful, mate, that the people that have fathered me have been people like yourself that have been so not just generous in their story, but I've come over and done intensives with you. I've spoken on the phone to you in phone counseling, and you've always given more than I've ever given you. And I just think that the legacy of that, mate, is that I try and do that with other people. And I know that that's the message that's coming across here, is that recovery is not done alone. Living isn't done alone. And life is long. And if we're lucky, we've got to go far, and it is best done together. And that's the main message I've got from you today, is that we've got to do this with each other. And
Yeah.
So that's my main message.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you so much for doing this. Means so much to me for what you said and how you put your action behind your words. I want to thank the people that joined us tonight or this morning.
Yes.
And I appreciate y'all very much. I began with a poem, so I'm going to end with a poem by Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet. And it goes like this. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. The door is round and open, and people are going back and forth crossing the door sill where this world and the other world touches. Don't go back to sleep. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you, John. Take care.
Stay
All right.
well, stay healthy, and maybe we'll see each other again sometime.
That'd be great. All right, John.